we're good to go.
We're
Hey?
good to go.
All right, I'll get started, Richard, if it's okay with you. Yeah?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. My name is Tony LaFerrara. I am the technical director with the National Soccer Coaching Association of Canada. So welcome to our Behind the Bench webinar, another one. And our guest today is Richard Bucciarelli. You all know Richard. He's the Director of Sports Science for the NSCAC. So today we're going to talk about fitness, integrating soccer fitness into your practices. Part one today, it's all about aerobic fitness. Part two and three, part two next week on Thursday, part three the following Thursday, and so on. And yeah, so that's what we're going to talk about today. I hope you have a lot of questions. Please, just write them down, and Richard will do his best to answer anything that he cannot answer. I will answer. Hey, Richard.
For sure. Yeah.
But I'm going to warn everybody before we get started that by the end of this, you're probably going to have a headache because the information that Richard, every time I speak with him, I always walk away with so much stuff that I didn't know before that I get a headache. So I hope you're ready for that. Richard, I'll throw it to you.
Great, thank you, Tony. And yeah, I hope everybody walks away with more than a headache, but perhaps the headache is okay too, as long as, yeah, as Tony said, as long as there's some knowledge that goes along with it. And I'll just quickly stop this sharing and I'll go to our little PowerPoint here. Okay. Making sure that we can see from the beginning, and I'll introduce and I'll get started, and I know Tony will probably have some questions along the way, and please, anyone else that's watching, right, we're live, so if you have a question that you'd like to ask, type it in the chat or the Q&A box, and as Tony mentioned, either him or myself will fill you in. And I'll mention as well, just that what we're going to talk about, the title, right, says Excerpts from the Soccer Fitness Trainers course. This is taken directly from my course, and you all would have received an email perhaps a few hours ago. If you're interested in setting up the course with your club or your academy, we're giving a pretty significant discount to do that. So please reach out, respond to the email. So with that being said, here we are. We're talking about putting soccer fitness into practices, and before we even get into the outline, what I am going to say is that this is something that I've spoken about a lot in the past in my own courses and online on podcasts, etc. And the basic idea here is that if you're a coach here in Canada, this is where we are here, and unless you're working in the national team or the TFC Academy and one of these elite international or professional environments, anywhere else, and I can tell you that even includes the university environment and the provincial leagues and all of that, we have to be honest, coaches don't have a professional fitness coach working with them all the time. Sometimes, and I know because I am a fitness coach and I do this work all the time, sometimes we come in once a week, twice a week, we get kind of incorporated into the planning and delivery of training, but not all the time. And so the reality is that since you don't have a professional fitness coach all the time, this information and learning how to simply integrate the principles of fitness and sports science into the practices that you're already running. And a lot of times you don't even really need to change your practices very much, but simply just paying attention to things like intensity and work to rest ratio and all of those things. This is really, to me, is like a mandatory component for training, because whether you like it or not, if you don't have a fitness coach there all the time, then you're the fitness coach. And so this is information that, it's really, to me, it's vital. It should be vital to you. I hope I can impress upon you the importance of all of this information and again, of integrating fitness into your practice. And the other thing, I just want you to keep in mind, it's a lot less complicated than you think. I know, we had a bit of a joke at the beginning, with Tony about, so much information and all that. There's a lot of information, but really when you think about it, you're already planning a practice. So I'm just giving you a little bit more information specifically about the physical part of the practice you're already doing. So, anyone can do this. We've had hundreds of people already coming through my course and they learn how to do it. and you can learn how to do it too. So that's what we're going to talk about. And the outline again, we've got 3 parts. Today, we're going to talk about aerobic training and a little bit about energy system training as a whole, and I'll introduce that concept in a few minutes. And then next week, we're going to talk specifically about speed and agility. And then finally, we're going to talk about strength and power. So with that little introduction and outline out of the way, what we'll do is we'll get started with the question, what is the aerobic system? And then how does it apply to soccer? Well, simply put, the aerobic system is a system that produces the largest amount of energy to do muscular work, but the energy that is produced at a lower intensity relative to the other 2 anaerobic systems. And the way that I like to explain this, we'll see this in a couple of points as well, but in order to work aerobically, especially as a soccer player, you don't work at a low intensity, because actually soccer is never, now maybe in a men's league, over 45, at the Sportsplex where my facility is, there's some low intensity.
Over 60, Richard.
Over 60, yeah. The intensity tends to go down in those leagues. But high performance soccer, the soccer that we're working with our players here, it is never low, the intensity. The heart rate is always quite high. There's a lot of running. Okay, everybody's moving a lot. It's just that to work aerobically, you actually are using oxygen to deliver energy to muscles. And so in order to use oxygen, you need to be, of course, breathing at a rate that is, let's say, slow enough that you're able to take in the oxygen and then use the oxygen to break down carbohydrates in your body and produce energy. So the basic idea is that the aerobic system provides a lot of energy at a slightly lower intensity than the other 2 systems, but it's still very high intensity. We have this molecule called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. That's the molecule that is produced through the aerobic system, and then it's broken down in order to actually allow the muscles to contract and perform work. If you're interested in the course, we have a whole physiology lecture all about this. If you're getting bad flashbacks from high school exercise science class or something, don't worry, we're not going to talk more about it today. Okay, that's how we summarize though. When you're working aerobically, you're using oxygen to deliver energy. And the reality is that at some point as a coach, if you don't train your players to develop the aerobic system, then they're not going to be able to deliver energy throughout a 70, 80, 90. And I mean, these days, I guess even yesterday, the Europa final was about what, 140 minutes almost?
146.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, so yeah, so you can't perform for that amount of time, 1.5 to 2+ hours, if you don't develop the aerobic system. So this isn't really a choice. Okay, and I know Tony and I, we'll probably talk about the different options.
Yeah, just another thing.
Yeah.
If you develop your aerobic system, then you have a better platform for developing your anaerobic system as well.
Absolutely.
So everything starts from, from the aerobic. From there, you can build into the other systems and perform well.
It does, and we'll speak about kind of how the aerobic system functions in soccer, because of the way it functions in soccer. Of course, you need energy over a long period of time, but the way you use the energy is in recovery in between all of the fast running that you have to do. So it's the base, it's the foundation. As I said, outside of the the men's and women's adult leagues that we see around the province, the high performance level youth players, they either train and develop the system or they cannot do it. And of course, if you get to the senior level, you need a strong aerobic system. So we move on, and a nice little Venn diagram on the side here, which kind of summarizes the 3 systems here. Okay, you can see on the bottom right, you've got the aerobic system. Think of it giving energy over the long term, 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. Doesn't matter if you're exercising over a long time, and we know that soccer goes, if you count a warm-up plus a 90-minute game, that's 2 hours. If you have extra time, and more, you have more. So the aerobic system is going to dominate over the long term. The immediate term and the short term, we've got these anaerobic lactic, anaerobic alactic systems. So basically the anaerobic systems, which are the one on the top and the one on the bottom left, they're the systems that deliver energy very quickly. And the reason that they deliver energy very quickly is actually that you don't require oxygen in order to produce energy. We're not going to get into too much of the physiology here. Again, if you want more of that, you can sign up for the course and we'll teach you about that. But really, the idea is that if you're working anaerobically, you need to get energy quickly. And the body has a couple of really fast ways to do it. And essentially, that's what happens is you work at a very high intensity for a very short period of time. You're working anaerobically. But when you're recovering in between those high intensity actions, then the recovery is driven primarily by the aerobic system. So the anaerobic alactic system, it provides energy for short duration, high intensity actions. And maybe Tony, you can think of, do you want to take a guess how many short duration, high intensity actions do we do in a typical soccer game?
Oh, Jesus, Richard. Between 1 and 100.
That's a good range. Yeah. Okay. You're pretty close. So typically the number of maximal sprints might be only 1 to 5. The number, if you want to count fast runs, now you can get into, depending on the level, 30 or 40 fast runs. And then if you want to include it, again, because it's not just running, there's high intensity actions, there's jumps, there's tackles and challenges for the ball, changes of direction, all of that. It can even go more than that. It can even go up to 300 high intensity actions throughout a game. And one way to think about, again, we're all coaches and we've all played, so we can probably think of how this looks, right? But soccer players change intensity and change the activity that they're doing about every 3 seconds. Okay, so over the course of a 90-minute game, roughly every 3 seconds, something new is happening. It's not always fast. There's walking and recovery as well, but there's a lot of short duration, high intensity actions, and it's the alactic system that gives energy for those actions. Okay, the anaerobic lactic system kicks in whenever we need to sustain high intensity action. What does that mean? That means that if you're doing any type of sprint or fast run over a longer period of time, and typically this means kind of longer than 10 seconds. Again, physiologically, we have about 10 seconds worth of energy where we don't start to produce lactic acid. And after that, we start to break down glucose in the body and we start to produce lactic acid. And a good fit soccer player can sustain, if they have to, they don't do it all the time, but they can sustain a high intensity action, perhaps for 20 seconds, perhaps for 30 seconds. A good visual of this, and the way that I like to train for that particular type of action is defensive pressing, specifically defensive pressing in the middle or the attacking third. Maybe, I know, Tony, we talked about defending before.
We did.
We talked about pressing, right? And
yeah.
So think of it this way. How quickly, if your team loses the ball in the middle of the attacking third and you want to press, how quickly would you like them to work before they win the ball back? How many seconds?
5.
Why? I agree with you, but why?
Well, first of all, they cannot sustain a very high intensity all the time. So they're gonna go nuts for 5 seconds and then they're gonna die.
Right.
And if they break the press, if the team with the ball breaks the press, you can't catch them. You're done. You need a little bit of time to recover. So you're gonna do it. You want to do it quickly. You want to do it effectively, and there you go.
Right. So often, when training for pressing, the exercises will involve, some kind of a target to try to win the ball back after 3 seconds or 5 seconds or 6, something like that, under 10 seconds. It can be done for longer, but then you start to get a lot of fatigue. You start to produce lactic acid, and sometimes the way to train is to do repeated bouts of 5 or 6 seconds, because you'll start to produce lactic acid by the second or the third bout. And so anyway, those are some ideas about these anaerobic systems. The short duration, high intensity actions in soccer, and we do hundreds of them. Okay, it's the alactic system giving energy for those. Any sustained or repeated high intensity actions without a lot of recovery, then you're starting to produce lactic acid. And That's the anaerobic lactic system giving energy for that. And then finally, the aerobic system. And this is what we have to understand about soccer. I know Tony and I, we talked a little bit about running training, and we can speak more about that. And if anyone has questions about it, we'll go through them. But the way the aerobic system works in soccer, okay, and this is why we have to understand the principle of specificity and making training specific to soccer. The way the aerobic system works in soccer is that it helps players to recover in between high intensity actions. The simplest way to think about recovery perhaps is just to say, well, you catch your breath quicker. And what happens if you catch your breath quicker? Well, then the next time you have to sprint or run fast or press or whatever, you're better able to do it. Physiologically, what's happening with recovery? Well, heart rate is going back down, not low, but to a lower manageable level. There's lactic acid in the muscles that needs to be removed. And there's also, the replenishment of something called creatine phosphate, which is stored in your muscles. So anyway, that's physiological recovery. But really, we can think about it as coaches is if our players are aerobically fit, they can catch their breath quicker and recover quicker after a sprint or a press or a series of little high intensity actions, and then they can do it again.
Yeah, Richard, they can use, if you're aerobically fit, you can use the oxygen in that situation more efficiently to recover. If you're not, then you need 4 or 5 seconds to get to it, and by that time it's too late. So by being aerobically fit, you can be more efficient in your recovery. You can use the oxygen more efficiently.
Right, and over time, what that means is that then players can do more high intensity actions or running in a game, and really they can do it when they need to do it. This is the thing to think about, and because this is a concept comes up a lot when I teach these courses. It's very interesting, and maybe I'll ask Tony and see what he thinks. If you looked at any top league, which are the players that you think run the most, or the teams that run the most? Are they the ones that win more, or the ones that win less? So if your team wins more, do you run more or less? What do you think?
Well, I guess it depends, Richard. It depends on.
But in general, if you looked at the top 3 teams versus the bottom 3 teams in any league, which teams run more?
Well, the bottom teams.
Why? I agree with you. Why?
Yeah. Well, they're always chasing. They're always. If now we're going to get into something else, which is my favorite topic, ball possession and all of that stuff. So if you're able to keep the ball, mentally, psychologically, you may be doing some running, but the body it's not affected as much if you're chasing without getting the ball, if you know what I mean, right?
Absolutely.
So ball possession, it's very important, even for this reason as well, right? But if you're chasing all the time, after a while, the intensity goes down, the energy goes down, and you don't end up performing well.
For sure, and you've hit the nail on the head. The teams that are more successful, they tend to run less, often because they keep the ball. Sometimes even if they don't, or the possession is equal, but what they do, if you're more successful, you control the rhythm and the tempo of the game.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's, again, it's a little more complicated. So you're right. It does depend. But always, when research is done, including even some of my own research in Canada, looking at the amount of running and the amount of fast running, the amount of high intensity actions, etc., that players and teams do, when teams are more successful, they run less. But as a coach, you have to prepare your players to be able to perform those high intensity actions when they need to. And if you don't train them aerobically, then what happens is they can't recover as quickly. And there's going to be moments, usually in the last 30 minutes, last 20 minutes, last 5 minutes, etc., right, where fatigue becomes a factor, and all of a sudden a player that should make a run doesn't, or makes it late, or just simply slows down a bit. And think of how many goals then are scored in the last few minutes of games. Part of the cause of that is aerobic fitness or lack of aerobic fitness. So I think, I don't know.
Richard, I wanted to add something, if you don't mind.
Of course, yeah.
You taught me all of this, so now I'm going to throw it back at you. The team organization as well will determine how much energy you're wasting during the soccer game. For example, if your shape is compact when you're defending,
right,
then you're using less energy as an individual, because now you're restricting the space.
Right.
So you don't need to run as much, right? I don't know if that makes sense. So
of course,
being compact when you're defending will definitely help you save some of the energy, right? Because now, you're not chasing, 40 yards, you may be chasing 5 yards because, your teammate is right beside you. The same thing when you are in possession. If your team is compact, meaning, from line to line, from the back four to your midfield to your forwards, there is short passing where you don't need to boot it up and chase after it all the time. So your team shape will affect, in a way, how much energy you consume during the game as well, right?
Right, and that goes back to the idea that teams that are more successful, they have a better team organization, they have a better team shape, so they end up running less, right? So no matter what, the idea is that, like, and this is what I would say to coaches, train your team so that they can run a lot if they have to, but coach them well so that they don't. Right. But I guess we're constantly in this battle and of how hard or how much running to do and everything. The idea really is that and I've experienced this even with teams that I've worked with. Sometimes if you're not prepared physically, you have a game plan and everything, but you go up against another team and now all of a sudden you can't keep the ball. They're better than you, or they've got a more skilled midfielder or something, or right. They're pressing and they're throwing you off. Then if you're not fit, then you're going to struggle for sure, right? So the idea is to train physically to be able to do the running, but tactically and based on your own strategy, ideally you want to run as little as possible in the actual games. So that's the idea. I don't know who's in the chat here. I see something here. Okay, right away. Hans says, too big a mistake on the part of coaches ignoring such things, basic things as physical abilities and growth stages in hormonal growth. They cannot have physical training methodology if they do not make previous evaluations and the training paradigms are not used correctly. So I agree, Hans, you're right. Again, here we're only talking about kind of training the energy system, but absolutely, if we're coaching youth players, we need to factor in the developmental age of the players, because that's going to tell you how much they can train, how hard they can train, how often, etc. And not everybody will be treated the same if they're developmentally different. And second of all, testing, like you mentioned, and seeing how fit they are is very important. And so these are all concepts, guys. If you like this and you want more, let's think about setting up the course. But that's the basic idea. So we're just going to show later in this presentation some examples of and really you may be surprised that what I'm going to show you it's just soccer practices. That's all it is, exercises or games, and they're not going to look like they're not fancy, because most training doesn't need to be fancy. All I'm going to show you is within these exercises and within these games how to control, or try to control anyway, for the intensity, the volume, the number of repetitions, all those things, so that you think about making it aerobic. And hopefully with that type of training, you're going to improve, again, the recovery between the high intensity actions. So no matter the energy system, all three of them, the anaerobic alactic, the anaerobic lactic, and the aerobic system, all three of them, basically when you train them, they follow the same activity pattern. And this is the pattern: sprint, rest, sprint. And not only do all of those energy systems look that way when you train them, but that also is the way that the game looks. So whether it's a training, exercise, drill, activity, or a small-sided game, or even the full game, if you think about what the players are actually doing, That's what they're doing. They're sprinting or running fast or doing some high intensity action. It may take 1 second, it may take 3 seconds. If it's a pressing, it may take 6 seconds, whatever. Then they're resting, and the resting might be standing still. The resting might be jogging or walking back into place or whatever, right? There's a a rest period, and then another sprint again, and it goes on and on and on like that for the whole game. Again, every 3 seconds there's a new activity in the actual game. So, I'll ask Tony first. So if that's the way the energy systems work, and that's the way the game looks, then if you want to make your training specific to the game, should you make your training look like this too, Tony? What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. Of course you can. Of course you can. You and I were talking about it before, though, about whether or not we're talking about using small-sided games. I know you're going to talk about it afterward. Yep. Maybe I should leave it, but you can use small-sided games to activate all of these systems, right? Whether it's the aerobic, anaerobic, and so on. And you can make it, because you're controlling it, you can put certain conditions that bring out, certain behaviors from the players, right? And you and I were talking about whether or not, a small-sided game, or maybe just straight running, which one is better? Is that, the small-sided game, is it good? Is it more effective, more efficient? Or is it just the straight running? Because I know I can control the straight running. I know how many times you ran. I know how long you're resting. I know the intensity you're putting in it. I can see it, right? In a small-sided game, it's always, there's always times in between while they're playing that they're not working hard, right? And so the coach always has to, come on, Johnny, go, come on, move, go get him, and all of that stuff. So yes, you can make it happen in a game. But my own opinion, Richard, it's that it's more difficult.
Okay,
more
yeah,
challenging. Let's say more challenging. Yeah.
Right, and so the answer to your question, which one is better? There is no right answer. I would say it depends, and it depends on what, as a coach, you want to focus on. So it's important that we don't become closed-minded or dogmatic about training and saying everything has to be on the field with the ball, everything has to be running. And I try not to be that way either, because I teach these courses, and here we are talking about integrating fitness in the practice, which means it's on the field with the ball and it looks like soccer. But I run a business where we make people run on treadmills, and there's no soccer field, there's no soccer ball, and it's very the way I talk about it is, you can think of a continuum. Okay, on one end you have specificity, on the other end you have predictability. So exercises or training that's as specific as possible all the way on the specific end, that's soccer. And the most specific way is actually 11 versus 11. That's why you'll see it in the pro level and the elite levels. A lot of practices, they play 11 versus 11. They spend a lot of time actually playing the game. And maybe the coaches will control certain things, or the timing, or they'll start the game from the half, or for like to try to work on something functional. But that's the most specific you can be, playing the game. On all the way the other end, the most predictable, well, that's running. That's and it's why I use treadmills, actually, because when you put someone on a treadmill, you can control the speed, the incline, that kind of thing. You can control the timing. Okay, so if you go specific, then you sacrifice a little bit of predictability, because the game is always going to be variable. We're going to show some examples, and a good coach should be able to plan games and small-sided exercises and things to try to put conditions and rules and objectives for the players that encourage intensity and encourage them to work, but it's always going to be variable. But the reality is the game is also variable. So that's why it's so specific, and that's why it's valuable. You sacrifice, though, when you do that, you sacrifice predictability. So if you want predictability, if you want to guarantee a certain heart rate, a certain number of runs, a certain intensity, all of that, then you go for predictable training. But what do you sacrifice there? You sacrifice specificity. So it depends. Both types of exercises are good. And also there's exercises along that continuum. A little passing exercise, which we're going to show, easier to control, more predictable, but still has passing and running and the ball, okay, as opposed to a small-sided game. So you can kind of imagine that continuum and sort of place your exercises along it. But the first thing to keep in mind is that all soccer training should look something like this, meaning a sprint or a high-intensity action, a rest period, and then another sprint and repeated bouts of that. You control or you manipulate those variables within that model. So you can make the sprints long, you can make them short, you can make them very, very fast, you can make them lower speed, you can have changes of direction, etc. And you can also manipulate the rest period. So when you plan training, it should always look like that. It should always look like sprint, rest, sprint, but you can, adjust those variables. And the other thing to keep in mind, and it says it up on the screen, so I just want to remind everyone before we look. I know there's some great questions coming, but that you can use the same exercise, and I'll show a few of them. You can use the same exercise to train any one of the 3 energy systems if you simply manipulate the length of the sprint period, the intensity of the sprint period, and the length of the rest. So if you want players to work aerobically, you have to make sure that they're doing lots of movement. The intensity might be a little bit lower, or you control the rest period so they're not recovering fully. Then it's aerobic. If you want it to be anaerobic lactic, it could be the same game or the same exercise, but you have to find some way to make them sustain the high intensity running. And that's why I like to play with pressing, but if they win the ball, they score, or they do it, and then they have to do it again. So they don't rest, or else they're only going 6 seconds at a time, right? Or if you want them to train for speed, and we'll talk more about that next week, but if you want to train for the anaerobic alactic system, you can make them run very fast, but then you have to give them more rest. So you can actually use the same exercise to train all 3 energy systems, or you can kind of tailor your plan, to what your objective is. So before we go on, there are some questions, and I think I'll go with Liz first. Liz has asked, is there a correlation between fitness and making good decisions on the field? Tony, what do you think about that? So the question is, if players are more fit, do they make better decisions? Yeah.
100%.
Okay. Why?
100%. Well, I mean, again, the brain needs oxygen to function properly, right? It's all about the oxygen thing. Yeah. And I know about this stuff, Richard, because I'm getting old and I eat a lot of oxygen.
Oh, yeah.
No, I mean, the oxygen goes to the brain and so on, right? So the fitter you are, again, we're talking about utilizing the oxygen better, right? More efficiently. Right. So yeah, you can make better decisions, obviously.
Yeah, that's very true. And Liz, there is, and there's excellent studies on this where they've actually measured cognitive performance after fatigue. We do some stuff even in our facility, because we have a clinic now, and we actually do cognitive training, brain training. And we typically, when players are new, we do the brain training first, and then we let them run. But once they're more experienced, we actually switch it, because we want them to train their brain for things like decision making and reaction time, all of that, when they're fatigued. Because yes, Liz, there is a correlation. If players are fitter, they make better decisions and they perform better cognitively across a range of abilities. So it's not just even decisions. I mentioned reaction time, the size of the peripheral field. It actually shrinks when you're tired, believe it or not. So you're not as good at scanning, takes longer to react to things. All of those abilities, they're affected by fatigue. And here's another way to think about it for Liz or anyone else that's listening. Okay, players who are playing at a higher level. I'm about to give a big talk on this on Monday next week at a conference in Portugal. So I've got the literature very clear in my head. So if you look at any country and you look at the top league versus the second or third or fourth division, every level that you go up, the players are fitter aerobically. They have a higher oxygen carrying capacity. They have a better, yo-yo test, all of that. So if you use that logic and you say, well, okay, we would have to assume that players in a higher league are also better at making decisions, right, Tony?
You would think so.
Well, it's probably one of the reasons why they're there, right? So there is that relationship. Players at a higher level are fitter, and of course, they also are cognitively better. So simply by the fact that we know that players at a high level, at the higher level leagues, are more aerobically fit, we can assume that there is a relationship between aerobic fitness and cognitive ability, and there's also research that's shown that there is as well. So hope that answers your question, Liz. Okay. Another question just before we go on, or kind of a comment from Mayor, right? My friend Mayor, who I haven't seen in a little while, but the training of endurance working of slow fibers is incompatible with football, according to Comedy. What is my opinion? Okay, so let's be clear. If you train the aerobic system focusing only on the slow twitch fibers, so we'll get into the physiology here, because you have fast twitch fibers and you have slow twitch fibers in your muscles, and they work differently. So training for endurance, training the slow fibers, that training is incompatible with football. You're right, Mayor, but if you were training that way aerobically, you actually wouldn't really be training for soccer. You certainly wouldn't be doing this model, sprint, rest, sprint. To train the aerobic system and focus on the slow fibers, that's more jogging or longer distance running or cycling.
Marathon, yeah.
Yeah, marathon running, cycling, those, which are, they're great forms of exercise, and they'll help you, lose weight and all of that. But they don't tend to help with soccer. Yeah, you're right. They're not compatible with soccer, because that's not how soccer looks. Soccer players need a strong aerobic system. But again, and I'll go back to the previous slide, just so we're clear on this, the aerobic system helps soccer players with recovery in between high intensity actions. So if we want the aerobic system for a soccer player to be better, we need to train them this way. We need to make them sprint or run fast. Then we control the rest period, and then we make them sprint again. So Mayor, you're right, but we have to think about, for aerobic training in soccer, it's not supposed to be continuous, long distance, slow. It's supposed to be a fast, high intensity action, some recovery, and then a fast, high intensity action again. Okay, and just the last question I hear before we move on, from Arun, who I know we've heard from many times here before as well. Isolated training to improve aerobic fitness in preseason is good. Yeah, sure. And keep in mind, actually, well, this is a good topic. Maybe one day we'll do another webinar just about this, Tony. But one of the biggest challenges that Canadian players, professional players in Canada have, and that includes the CPL and the MLS, if they ever have to go from there into a European, or even into Mexico or into South America, we don't play enough. Our competitive season is very short, and we have a long off season and sometimes a long preseason. These days, in a lot of the top leagues around the world, players have maybe a month off, between the end of one season and the start of the next preseason. Whereas in the CPL, for example, the season can end in the middle of October and doesn't start again until April, right? So it's almost half the year. And so, yes, Arun, the isolated training, more predictable training, running training, whatever, it's more useful either off season or preseason. As you get into, the competitive season, it's much better to make the training more specific. And we probably should move on, but I'll say that if you're more interested in those topics, well, we have lessons on periodization in my course, and we talk about exactly how to do that. Again, because there's no right or wrong way, you have to be somewhere on the continuum, but definitely in season, more specific training is better. So we'll move on. And we'll talk about specifically, within that model of sprint, rest, sprint, what are the variables that coaches need to think about and manipulate when planning training? And we'll start with the variables of the sprint. And remember, what we're talking about here, that's the high intensity action, the first part of whatever training you're doing. First of all, it's the time. Okay, and keep in mind, we can think of, if it's any type of exercise or game, you don't need to think too much about each individual action that a player does. So here's the way I'll explain it to you. let's say, we're giving a range of 30 seconds to 10 minutes. Let's just say you went in the middle of that and you went 5 minutes. Let's say a 5-minute game, and maybe it was 8 versus 8 for 5 minutes. That's a small-sided game. You don't need to look at every player throughout the 5 minutes and time every single run that he or she does. If you do that, you're going to go crazy. You'll never be able to keep track of it. And it's not necessarily that important as long as you look at the overall time period and what's happening overall or globally. So that's the idea, that the aerobic exercises, even if it is something where players are resting and working within the time period, the total time, the overall time, should be a minimum of 30 seconds and a maximum of 10 minutes. Less than 30 seconds. The reason that that's the minimum amount is because if it's less than that, then you're really not training or running or moving enough to stimulate the aerobic system.
But you're training a different system. Right?
You're training a different system then. Yeah. You're training the alactic or the anaerobic lactic system. And a maximum of 10 minutes, that, like, you can go longer, but really if you start to play around with small-sided games, and what you'll see, if you go even more than about 8 minutes, to be honest, what starts to happen, Tony, to the intensity?
Yeah, it goes down.
Starts to go down, right? So I would leave 10 minutes as a maximum, and really, if you're within that, if you're 5 minutes or 8 minutes or 6 minutes, that's kind of the idea, okay? And remember, this can be, and I'll show, this can be a game or it can be an exercise. I'm going to show examples of both, and I'm just I don't want to say warning everybody now, but I'm just going to say that, just to prepare you, that all you're going to see in these examples is soccer training and stuff that you've probably already done a million times with your own team. Nothing fancy for sure. Okay, so that's the time. The type, okay, well, we have small-sided games and we have some type of technical exercise. That's what we have, if we want to make it specific. Yes, there's running exercises and hills and all these other things, but here the purpose of this little mini course is we're talking about integrating fitness into the practice. So you have small-sided games or you have technical exercises. Okay, then we have the intensity, or you can think of it maybe as the speed of movement, but really we want to kind of focus on the second word there after the slash, which is intensity. And again, we're not talking a lot here about this concept, but there is something called rating of perceived exertion, or RPE. And this is a way, without a heart rate monitor, that any coach or any player can rate the intensity of the work that they're doing. And this particular scale that I like to use is from 0 to 10, meaning 0, if the intensity is rated as a 0, then that means you're resting, you're doing nothing. And if the intensity is rated as a 10 on the other end of the scale, that's maximal. That's the hardest work you could do. So if we're going to train aerobically, the overall intensity, not each sprint that's done in a game or in an exercise, because of course each sprint is as fast as you can, the overall intensity should be 7 to 8 out of 10. And remember, Tony, I said at the beginning, the aerobic system, you train it at a lower intensity relative to the other two systems, which are usually maximal, but you don't train low, right? 7 out of 10 is not low, is it?
Well, no, it's more than average, right?
Yeah, it's 70%. Right?
So it's between, yeah. And that's what it should be. Richard, is there a way to measure that on the field when the players are training, where you ask them to take their pulse?
Yeah.
And it should be, I mean, you can do all of this ahead of time, according to their age and so on and on. And you can have an idea of what intensity they should be at. And that can help them, monitor themselves as well, right?
100%. Yeah. So there's lots of different ways. Like my suggestion a lot of times is simply, it's based on sort of what I think is the most practical. And the most practical is to get the picture of the overall training session, and you ask the player right at the end. So you train for 90 minutes, you ask them at the end to rate the overall session. And, if it was 8 out of 10 or 7 out of 10, you can do it. If you want to be more specific, it takes more time and more planning. but you can, because we all know that, the aerobic part of the training, it's not the whole session. You have a warm up, you have maybe some other exercise, then you have some tactics or free kicks or whatever, you have other things. So you can simply get the intensity by asking the players at the end of the small-sided games. Okay? So let's say you did 4 small-sided games, you finished those 4, that took you 20 minutes in total, plus the rest periods, whatever, or 30 minutes, you ask them at the end. And now you have the RPE just for that part. You can even take the RPE after each repetition and average them out. Again, this is like, when I talk about what's practical, I'm thinking, often, in the club environment, it's one coach, 18 players, a lot of things, to think about, and may not be practical to take all of these measurements, but you can do that. And you can also spot check. So this is something that I've used a lot, where you just, because you're going to play again, a small-sided game or an exercise, and there's going to be some rest. So in the rest period, maybe there's a minute of rest or whatever. Ask 3 or 4 players. Just say, hey, are we at 7 out of 10? Are we at 8 out of 10? If they give you the thumbs up, good. If not, it probably wasn't hard enough. You need to do something else. You need to make the field bigger, or So.
Richard, you were a player, right?
For a little while. I think I played for you.
You did. Players lie.
I never did.
Especially if you ask them, how did you work hard? Oh yeah, coach. Oh man, But so yes, I think in an ideal situation, and this is only my opinion.
Yeah.
In an ideal situation, you trust your players. The players are motivated, blah, blah, all of that stuff, right? They're going to be, hey, coach, I didn't work hard enough,
Right.
But for the most part, they're going to go, oh yeah, man, I'm really sweating here, I'm really tired. But you as a coach, you're watching, you're seeing what's going on, right?
Yeah.
So you also have an idea of, are they lying to me or what? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So this speaks to, first of all, okay, of course, the rating of perceived exertion, it's subjective, and so first of all, you may have players that don't quite understand what 7 or 8 out of 10 really feels like, and they don't get it. And then you may have players that are being dishonest one way or the other, because they might want you to think that they're working really hard, and then they'll tell you 9 out of 10 all the time. Or they might think, shit, if I tell Tony that this was a 9, then he's going to be like, oh yeah, this is good, but maybe I'm going to tell him it was a 5, because then he's going to think that I'm so fit, everybody else was dying, but I'm the fittest. You know what I mean? So you don't know. They could, of course, people can be that way. That speaks to why, if coaches, if you can afford it, if you can work it into your budget or whatever, technology like heart rate monitors and GPS or accelerometers are really valuable. Again, it's not a plug for it or whatever, but with my course, okay, we have a special discount on an excellent product called Beyond Pulse, which has a heart rate and accelerometer, and it's designed specifically for soccer and for the youth amateur, teams and coaches, because it's good, technology, but it's also affordable, much more affordable than some of the GPS, and that has to do with the fact that it's an accelerometer rather than a GPS. But the basic idea is that if you measure with a heart rate and a GPS or an accelerometer, then you get more accurate data, and then you don't need to worry about players being dishonest. And the other thing, which I guess Guardiola has said many times, is that there's also the iometer, which we can't forget to use that. And sometimes, often, especially if you're doing very high intensity training, you can simply just see by how hard the players are breathing. I mean, they can't fake that, right? How much they're sweating, you can kind of judge almost a little bit based on that. So I think it's important to consider everything. But RPE, if players are honest, RPE is actually very well correlated to heart rate. But if they're not, then you want to go with technology and eliminate the the guessing or the subjectivity. So I see, I don't know, there's a question here. Mayor, okay, says, so we're just back to it. Yeah, it says, back to what we talked about before, take into account in some countries, the approach has to be adjustable to the characteristics of the football styles, the qualities of the footballs and the methodology. Mayor, yeah, you're right. I think, well, I can speak about Canada and I can speak about Uruguay because those are the two countries that I've worked in, and both at the professional level. And a challenge that we have in Canada is, and it's probably mainly because we don't have the professional system. We even our pro leagues, we don't have promotion and relegation. It's hard to really get the same type of attitude and work ethic and everything out of the players. So a challenge we have in Canada is that often we don't train hard enough. And it's actually perhaps, Mayor, why the running and the predictable training is more effective here, because you force players to run because they don't always work hard on their own. In Uruguay, I can tell you that when I was there, every exercise, didn't matter what it was, if it was a warm-up, if it was a game of tag, everybody ran they not only they ran as fast as they could, and they cheated, and we had a great talk with Rafael Carvajal, who I know Tony knows very well, and good friend of ours, and he's been on our show and everything too, and he was the head coach, right? I was his fitness coach there, and I remember one time we did a little speed exercise, and players were supposed to go around a cone diagonally and then go forward and chase and get to a gate before the other player, and every single time they were cheating. And they got really competitive, but to the point where they're almost fighting with each other. And I remember looking at Rafa, at the head coach, and saying, "Look how they cheat," and I was almost saying, kind of criticizing them. And he looked at me and he smiled and he said, "Yeah." I said, "Isn't it great?" So that's the culture. And sometimes if we have a slightly less competitive culture, then we have to sometimes change the way we train. Okay, so going back to the variables here, the rest, which is the period in between the sprints. It's fairly simple. You control the time, more or less. The time, it can be equal to the time that you worked for, and it can be even a little bit less. So 30 seconds to 10 minutes is the range, but often for the aerobic system, you can go with a work to rest ratio of 1-to-1. That means you work for a certain period of time and you rest for the same period of time, or you can rest half of what you work, which would be a 2-to-1 work to rest ratio, or even only 1/3, 3-to-1. Typically, when you're using shorter work periods, 30-second work periods, 1-minute work periods, that the intensity tends to be pretty high, and the work to rest ratio is probably better 1-to-1. Meaning you work for 1 minute, you rest for 1 minute. That kind of thing. You work for 2 minutes, you rest for 2 minutes. Also, those types of games tend to be smaller, like 1v1 or 2v2, that kind of thing. If you use longer work periods, for example, maybe a small-sided game that's 6 minutes or 8 minutes, you don't need to rest for 6 or 8 minutes. And I think coaches, like if you're experienced, you probably know this already, but often a 6-minute game, for example, you could probably get away with a 2-minute rest period. They step off, they catch their breath, they drink some water, maybe there's a little talk to them about the tactics or something, and you go back out and play again. Okay, so that's a guideline, and it's not in this presentation. We talk about it in the course, but a real simple way to plan your work periods, if you're playing small-sided games and you're using even numbers, 2 against 2, 3 against 3, whatever, right? If you're not playing numbers up or numbers down, you can make the time of the game equal to the number of players on one of the teams. So for example, 2v2, a good amount of time is 2 minutes. You can't really play 2v2 for 6 minutes. Like, as a matter of fact, even 2 minutes, if it's really intense, it's just about enough. 4v4, you can play for 4 minutes. 6v6, you can play for 6. It doesn't have to be. You can vary it a little bit, but often, if you think about it, the more players you have, well, what happens? Of course, not everybody's touching the ball or not everybody's involved all the time, which means the intensity tends to go down a bit. Not low, right? It's always high. It's just not as high. The most intense type of game is either a 1v1, where both players are basically battling the whole time, or a numbers up or numbers down type scenario, and then it's the group that's numbers down that tends to work very, very intense. But that's a general rule, okay, for the time of the rest. And then there's active rest or passive rest. So simply put, is it active? Do you want to let them do keep ups or passing or something while they're resting? Or do they just need to catch their breath? And a lot of times that's going to depend more on the intensity of the work. If they've worked at a very high intensity, they need some time to catch their breath. If it's a little lower, or it's moderate or something, you can get away with active recovery. And sometimes, also this is a challenge, I think, with coaches planning training. You don't always have the numbers that you want, right? You might want to have only 16 or something, but there's 2 guest players, or maybe you wanted 18, but 2 of them are hurt, and you need a neutral player. So you can work in, for example, maybe you have 4v4 in a game, that's 8, and the others are doing some passing or something, so they're not resting, and then they rotate in. So there's lots of ways to do it, but that's the basic idea with your sprint variables and your rest variables. So maybe I'll stop there before we look at the examples. I don't know if anyone else has questions, or Tony, I don't know if there's any questions before we look at some of these games. Yeah.
I have a few questions, Richard.
Sure. Yeah.
So, and this is related to aerobic and anaerobic and all of that, but
yeah,
different positions on the field, center backs, full backs,
right,
wing backs as they call them now, midfielders, holding midfield, all of those, right? Do you train them all the same, or you be more specific? Now, I need to make a comment so I don't sound stupid. Maybe
yeah.
I will sound stupid anyway.
No.
But I think aerobically, you might want to treat them all the same, or perhaps, like you said before, just make it a little, let them go a little bit higher than normal, right? But then when it comes to being specific with certain roles, then I would think that you would train them differently, would you?
Yes, and yeah, so this is what I would say is a great question, and the answer to almost all of the good questions, and I say this even in my course, like even in the university where I teach, almost always, the answer to a good question is it depends. So the first thing is, if the goal is to really build the aerobic system, sometimes you're going to play these games where everyone is sort of treated the same. If it's a 4v4, a 3v3, I mean, it doesn't matter if you're a center back or whatever, you're basically doing the same things. You can, even in small-sided games, you can have, a 4v4, for an example. If they're playing in a diamond, maybe the central midfielder or the center back is the bottom of the diamond and the wide players are there. But, in those small scenarios, they tend to do very similar type of work regardless of where they are on the pitch. But if it's a 6v6 or an 8v8 or something like that, maybe they can be a little bit more in their own position. Okay, but then again, right, if the goal is to build the aerobic system, then sometimes you need, there's the principle of overload. So we talked about the principle of specificity, which gives you the, basically is the idea that, you adapt specific and relevant to the demands of your training. The principle of overload states that in order for a physiological system to improve, you need to overload it, meaning you need to do more than what it's actually capable of right at that time. So if the center backs are, they're not running a lot all the time, whatever, and you never train them to run a lot, well, at some point there may be a moment where there's a lot of action happening in the game. Maybe they've gone up to try to score on a corner kick or something, and now they have to make a run back. These kind of things, maybe they're not ready for it because they haven't been trained. So sometimes when you're training aerobically, yes, absolutely, you might train everyone together. Now, if we're talking about periodization and the plan throughout the season, at some point, and I know I touched on this with, I don't know if it was Liz or Arun's question, I think before, but about progressing. So starting with more general training and making it more specific. Well, that example of the 4 versus 4 game, it's specific in the sense that it's soccer, but it's also not as specific as an 8v8, a 9v9, or even an 11v11. And it's also not as specific as a functional exercise where players are literally in the same position that they normally play in the same part of the field, etc. And so typically, if you're going to progress to making your training more specific as you go on throughout the year, then maybe you transition more away from the small-sided games where everybody does the same thing and more towards the functional or the larger games where people are it's more specific because they're in their position and they're on the field. And, there is this model of tactical periodization, which is really interesting. And, we've had, even on the show, we've had some Portuguese coaches that have used it. And I was kind of lucky in my career when I worked with the Ottawa Fury that I was the fitness coach for Nikola Popovic, who is a Portuguese coach and studied under Vitor Frade there and learned that model. And we tried to use that model in Canada. And that actually speaks to what Mayor said about the culture. And the Canadians didn't like it. I can tell you that they initially in preseason, everybody was complaining that they said that the training wasn't hard enough. And then later on, they started complaining that it's too hard. We're doing too much 11v11, not enough recovery, all that. So they weren't used to it. And part of that, I think, was the culture. But the tactical periodization model, it doesn't even just put players, in a functional session or doing things that, on this part of the field where they normally are. It literally, all of your training is done exactly to the way you want the team to play. Meaning, if you don't want your team to run a lot in your games, you don't make them run a lot in training. You train only the same way you want to defend, the same way you want to attack. There's very limited overload, and it's complicated, but yeah, I don't know. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Richard, I have another question for you.
Yeah.
So, what is the importance of testing? Before you start doing anything, whether you are in off-season, pre-season, in-season, all of that. Because, we know we could learn all of the, specific rules that apply to developing aerobic, anaerobic, and so on fitness.
Right.
What is the importance of testing in all of this?
Okay, so it's another good question. And what I would say is, without testing, first of all, you don't know exactly what the baseline level of fitness of your players is. And if you don't know that, then it's very difficult for you to plan training. In my course, we have a whole module on fitness testing, and I use a quote from Yogi Berra, old baseball player, but and he has a lot of these funny quotes. And one of them, he says, if you don't know where you're going, you'll wind up someplace else. And it's kind of a joke, but if you think about it, it's very true in the sense that, well, if you don't test, how do you know how fit the players are? You can guess, you can see how they perform in the games, and if they're always tired, okay, fine, but you don't really know the details right now. Now, how can you plan training? What are you basing your plan on? What's the level of intensity? What's the load that you're going to, use in your training? Are you just guessing? Are you just saying, well, I saw, I took a course and they told me that you have to play 5 against 5 for 5 minutes. And well, yeah, but maybe your players can do it for 8 minutes. Maybe your players can handle more or less, or, and I know even Mayor was speaking about the developmental age of the players, like testing, and really the more you need valid and reliable tests, but you also need tests that give you meaningful data, and that's important, right? And that's testing, and even any data you collect. If you're collecting heart rate or GPS, or it's one of the reasons why I like Beyond Pulse, because they simplify the data a lot. But you need data from testing that is meaningful, that you can then use to help you be more efficient in your planning. So I would say that's why you need it, and that's why it's so important. So, okay, so it's it's a little past 3 o'clock. I think maybe we'll get into some of the examples of the games here, and rather than try to get the PowerPoint to do what I wanted to do, I'll stop here, and we're gonna look at the games themselves. So, okay, just again, I want everyone to keep in mind we're watching soccer activities and soccer games. That's all they look like. So I'm going to show you a couple of activities and then a couple of games, and maybe then we can finish just with a little comment and discussion about some of them. So we're going to start with this little activity, which is a 1v1 defending, 1v1 attacking defending exercise. So I hope everyone can see it. And I also hope that you can hear it as well. And by the way, these are all from former NSCAC clinics that we did. These are all before COVID, when everyone was still allowed to get together in person. Here. Can you hear?
No.
No? Oh. Wait. So you can't hear it?
No, I can, Richard.
Well, how do you get the volume on? I don't know. Can't mute. Huh. Strange, because, well, you know, I guess we can just watch the exercise.
Yeah,
Maybe we don't need. Yeah, it's not, as I
maybe
said.
I'm the
It's,
only one that can't hear.
yeah, it's just a soccer exercise anyway, so you don't really need to hear what I'm saying. Just watch. All right, so we've seen enough of that one. You can hear me now, right, Tony?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. All right. So whether we heard that, you know, what did we have there? Well, we had 4 players on one side and 4 on the other, and really only 2 of them were working at a time. So you might call the work to rest ratio of that exercise 1-3, you know, 1 working, 3 resting, whatever. But I'm still calling this an aerobic exercise. So maybe I'll ask you why. Why is it aerobic?
The work to rest is short.
Overall, the work to rest is short, but overall, from the time that one player goes until the time they go again, and this is why I've got a lot of balls at my feet, right? And they're bringing the balls back to me right away. And as soon as it's over, I start the exercise again. They're not really resting that much.
You're not resting him.
So maybe by the first or second rep, they're still okay. Then they start to get tired. And remember, I said the total time is what we got to think about. We played, you won't see it here, right? But we played this exercise for 2 minutes. And I can tell you, and you know, it's hard to see. I don't know if later on I can see my colleague Farzad is in there. Well, you can't see him. He's kind of kneeling behind the coaches there. This was a clinic where every player was wearing a heart rate monitor. And by the time we got to the end of the 2-minute period, almost every player's heart rate was above 170 beats per minute. We played for 2 minutes. We only rested for 1, and then we played again, and we did 4 of them. Okay, so this is soccer. This is just a small field. Okay, it's about 12 yards by 18 yards in terms of, you know, width and length, with a little goal on one side, and the coach serves the ball in and they play 1v1. But of course, you know, does it look like soccer? Yeah, sure. You've got a defender coming to press. You've got an attacker that has to beat the player and try to score. If the defender wins the ball, he's got a clear objective to try to dribble over the line. Okay, so this can be used as an aerobic session as long as you make sure you don't have too many players on the outside and you keep things moving. Could it also be an anaerobic session, Tony? What do you think?
Could it be an anaerobic session?
Yeah.
Yes, if you what is it? The work to rest ratio, it's longer.
Yeah. To make it
so
more anaerobic, we might add players. We might maybe lengthen it a bit, or we might even just give a little more rest. Maybe all 4 of them go, and then they all rest for 30 seconds or something before they go again. So yeah. This is the thing. You can make this, and that's the thing with soccer. You can make most soccer exercises aerobic or anaerobic. You just simply have to manipulate those variables, which is the length of the sprint and the length of the rest period. So again, as I said, it's not something that you have to imagine is very complicated. It's just a simple 1v1 exercise, and that's one. I'll show the next one, which is another exercise. And we have to go here. Here, hold on. Here, Camtasia. Okay. So now our next exercise, which was from another clinic out in Hamilton with Ian McClurg. Okay, and I'm gonna fast forward it a little bit because this is me explaining it. Okay, that's me explaining it. Okay, so I just want to leave that there, that we've got these players organized in this little square, which is 10 meters by 10 meters. 2 of the corners have a player with a ball. 2 of the corners have a player without a ball. I'm telling these players without the ball that you're going to see them. They're going to sprint. They're going to work very fast, and they're going to go to one side, make a little pass, a one-touch pass, then sprint in a certain way by looking at the ball, run around the cone and go around the corner and go to the other side to make another pass. I'm giving them 30 seconds, and I'm saying they have to get 9 passes. That's 3 passes every 10 seconds. So it's much more predictable, right? It's not as specific. There's a ball and there's running and passing, but it's, it's very controlled. But I'm telling them 9 passes, and that's because I want a certain intensity, and we can just watch them do it now. Won't take long. Okay, fast forward a little bit more, make sure they're ready. Here they go. Okay. Okay, so I'll stop it there. If you wanted to guess, unfortunately, they only got 8 passes. They didn't get 9. So it's a simple exercise. Again, nothing complicated here, nothing fancy. This, with a 30-second work period and a 30-second rest period, it's a great way to train the aerobic system, and also to bring in a little bit of even the anaerobic lactic system. Much less specific than the first example, much more predictable though than the first example. Tony, if we wanted to make it more anaerobic, yeah. Oh, you got your hand up. Yeah, you have a question for me.
So yeah. I love this setup, Richard. Yeah. So one of the activities that I did with the players, aerobic activity with them, it was called the box of death. Do you know about it? Do you know about the box?
I think I remember it, but yeah.
Okay, so what they do is there's a box. Obviously, you make a box, a 10 by 10 or 15 by 15, but a 10 by 10, it's more workable. So what they do is they sprint, they jog from one cone to the other. Then the next one, they walk. The next one, they jog 2 and they walk 2. They jog 3, they walk 3, they jog 4, they walk 4, then they come down, they do 3, and then they do 2, and then they do 1, right? Yeah. So the work to rest, it's basically, the rest is active rest, right?
Yeah.
And so, and my players hated that. And I used to sort of warn them and say, hey, look, hey, you know what, we're doing this. Now, if you're not putting all your efforts into this, then we're doing the box of death. Oh, no.
That was the threat.
Sometimes we did it anyway, but, I liked it because it really, challenged the players, right? I would do it at a low intensity first. Mm-hmm. So sometimes in the middle of the week, I would do it at a higher intensity. Like you jog at a 70%, from one cone to the other, and then you walk, and then you sprint 2, and so on. So I love it. I mean, I really, really enjoy it. Sometimes we did it with a ball. We had a whole bunch of them set up, and you run with the ball from one cone to the other, and then you jog, and then you pick up another ball, and so on. So it's one of my favorite, only because I could really punish the players when I wanted to.
Well, and think of it this way: that on that continuum, it's a little more towards predictability, right?
Yeah.
Right, but still, okay, it's still short sprints. It's still, there's a work to rest ratio. It's not as predictable as like a treadmill run. There's still, you're on the field. You said you can add a ball. This one too, right? The running is really controlled. I mean, I'm telling them exactly how I want them to run. I'm telling them face the ball, sprint, change direction, pass. Like it's very predictable. So there's nothing wrong with these exercises. They're very good to build fitness because you can control the running that they're doing. So yeah, and this one, to be honest, players don't really like it. Okay, but it's
Richard, another thing that I did, sometimes I would do it in groups of 2s.
Yeah.
So I would put one of my fit players with one that was not as fit.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I would say, you better keep up.
Yeah.
Because then, you'll do one more circuit. And so I was forcing the other player who was not as fit to really work hard, to really
Right.
try hard,
Right.
without holding anything back, right?
Right.
Maybe it's wrong. I don't know, but
It's not right or wrong,
we did
right?
it.
Yeah, it depends. Yeah. So again, just examples, and these are some of the the more predictable exercises. Okay, Liz, how many reps? Let me answer that quickly. Okay, so typically, if we're talking about like the total amount of time, actually is probably the best way to look at it. Okay, and the total amount of time probably should be somewhere between a minimum of 10 minutes and a maximum of 30 minutes. Okay, that includes the rest periods. These 30-second intervals, I don't think you can do them for 30 minutes. Like, it's a little too much. So if you're going to go 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, you might do about 5. I kind of like that, 5 or 6 reps. Then you're going to give them a longer break because they should be pretty tired. Like, honestly, they're going to need it. And then maybe another 5 or 6. And then that total amount of time is 15 minutes. If it's the previous exercise, we showed the 1v1 defending. As I said, we played for 2 minutes and rested for 1. So that was a total amount of time of 3 minutes. I might do 4 or 5 of those. So 5 times 3 minutes is 15 minutes. Some of the longer games, we'll show some small-sided games in a minute, but some of the longer games, you could probably go with a total amount of time of closer to 30 minutes. I mentioned, well, we'll show a little counterattack game, a 2v2 counterattack game, which I like to play for 3 minutes, and I like to rest for 1.5 minutes. So 3 plus 1.5 is 4.5, and I like to do it 4 times. So we're talking, about 20 minutes or so. So Liz, I hope that answers your question. 10 to 30 minutes, including the rest, and you build your number of repetitions and all of that based on that. So let's go. We'll look at the games. Okay, and the first game that we'll look at, is this the one? Just want to make sure it's the right one. Right. Okay. All right. So, okay, this is again from another clinic with Coach Valerio. He's our vice president, right? And this is from his academy. And keeping in mind these are young. This was a clinic that we did with basically youth under 8 to under 12, and I believe these were about under 10. Okay, so it's not going to look like anything other than some type of soccer, but we'll have a look with these young players. Okay, so it's a field where you have a ball on top of a cone on either end of the field. Okay, I'm going to demonstrate what I want them to do. Hand passing. You can't run with the ball. You can only run without the ball. So I'm just demoing for them here just to show them how to score. Okay, you can't run with the ball. You can only run without the ball. And you score here. I think I scored a goal there just to show them you score by knocking the ball off the cone. Okay, so now maybe we can let's watch them play a little bit. Just trying to get them to start here. Yeah. Okay. Here. Okay. So there they are. They're playing, right? Okay. Again, these are young players, but there's no reason why we can't think about the design of our games to try to challenge the aerobic system. Okay. There. See, not a lot of movement off the ball. You lose the ball here. Good. Okay. All right. So, okay. Again, I mentioned to everybody that it just looks like soccer. There's nothing fancy or complicated about it. Okay. In this particular exercise, of course, they're passing with their hands, but they are learning a lot of tactical things. They're learning about support. They're learning about angles of support in front, behind, etc. Okay. This can be a very physically demanding game, And I showed it with young players, but this is actually something that I like to use even with older, with university or professional players to build the aerobic system, because you can get quite a lot of running from the players off the ball when they're using their hands. So that's the basic idea with with this type of small-sided game. Okay, this game, it was, I think it started as a 3 against 3, but eventually then we had neutrals and we made it into a 4 against 4. They can play this for 4 minutes. Remember, we said 4. If it's 4 players on the team, that's the number of minutes you can play for. They could even play for 5 or 6 minutes. You can give incentives. You can say, maybe the team that scores less than the other has to do push-ups. You can try to put some constraints or conditions into the game to try to raise the intensity. And also, even you as a coach, like if a ball goes out, put one back in right away, encourage them, do things to try to change and raise the intensity if needed. So I don't know if Tony's just gone out for a minute, but we'll have a look at our last game, and then I'll just leave it for anyone else who has some questions at the end. So let's have a look at this last one here. Okay, Tony's back.
Sorry, Richard.
No problem. Okay. And so this is it's taken from my course, from the online version of my course, and a little diagram here. So coaches, maybe you've seen these types of games before. It's a counterattack game, 2 against 2. But anytime there's a shot on target, even if it scores or not, doesn't have to be a goal, but any shot on target, what happens is the shooter in white here will run around a cone, temporarily taking themselves out of the play, and a new 2 will attack the 1. So you can call it 2v2, but it's really a continuous 2 against 1. Okay, so keep in mind this was a girls' team, nice team, nice, good attitude and all that. Not the greatest technical ability of this team, so maybe you'll see doesn't look as well as I would have liked it, but you'll get the idea when you see it. So. Okay, so we'll watch here. All right, so we got the idea, and maybe I'll go back to that diagram. We can keep the diagram on the screen while we talk about it. So that particular game, again, like the defending the 1v1 exercise we saw at the beginning, you don't have players in the game moving all the time, right, Tony? There are some players on the outside, and they're resting.
They're resting, yeah.
But why am I still calling it an aerobic game?
Well, again, it's all about the work to rest ratio, right?
They're not resting that much, right?
Yeah. But they're not resting that much, so they don't have time to recover, so they're always going. But
right, and again,
the point where you say, okay, everybody take a break, right?
Exactly, yeah. So I've kind of diagrammed it with 3 on each side, and one other playing. So you can almost again think of in the exercise itself, the work to rest ratio is 1 to 3. Right? You have 1, you have 2 white and 6 resting, so you can simplify that down to to a 1 to 3 ratio. Okay, but the idea is that the players, even when they make their attacking move and they score, even though they're off quickly, they're not recovering enough. They're only resting for 10 seconds. To fully recover, they might need 30 seconds or a minute. So the second time they do it, the third time, and again, as I said, I like to play this for 2 to 3 minutes even. Okay, they're very tired at the end of that, right? But then they get to rest for 2 to 3 minutes. And in that rest period, first of all, you're collecting balls and organizing the game, they're drinking water, but also because you have 2 to 3 minutes of rest, you can coach them.
Richard,
Yeah.
Would you call that interval training?
Absolutely. All of what we're talking about is
Yeah.
interval training. And if we go back to the sprint, rest, sprint, that model, that's what interval training is. It's actually high intensity interval training, or HIIT training, because of course the intensity of the intervals is very high, right? And as a matter of fact, even if you're doing running training in soccer, the best way to train is by doing high intensity interval training. So continuous, back to kind of what I think it was, maybe was Mayor was saying about the, the long continuous running training. Even if you want to run to train for soccer, the best way to do it is to do interval training. And actually the timing is very similar. You might run for 2 minutes and then rest for 2 minutes. And, so this is quite high towards the end of specificity. There's a game, there's attacking and defending, there's numbers up and numbers down. The player, I think we got a few good views of it, but sometimes that player made a really nice recovery run, right? So they're working on playing in transition, countering, to try to score a goal quickly while the defending team is outnumbered. So there's a lot of tactics you can bring into, coaching, and you can do this instead of 2v2, you can do it with a 3v3, and then it becomes a continuous 3 against 2. You can even do it. I've seen it even with 4v4, right? If you have the numbers for it. So again, to go back to sort of the theme of what we're talking about today, this is incorporating the fitness into your training. So you choose the games. These are just some examples, but there's hundreds of examples. Any small-sided game can be done. You just have to start to look again, the work period, the rest period, the work to rest ratio, the intensity, all of those things. So I'll stop it there, and we'll bring it back to the slideshow here, because we saw all 4 of those. So I'm gonna, I'll conclude, and then maybe some questions at the end. So these are the questions when we're talking about planning aerobic sessions. These are the questions to ask yourself. First of all, does the activity or the game look like soccer? Okay, if it doesn't look like soccer at all, probably there's something that needs to be changed. And it doesn't mean, again, there's running training you can do, of course, but that's not what we're talking about here. The topic here is integrating soccer fitness into your practice. It has to look like soccer. Think about the principle of specificity. Second, is the intensity of your work period appropriate? And again, it doesn't mean, of course, you understand when the players are doing, even in that counterattack, when they're doing the counterattack, of course, they're going at 10 out of 10. They're sprinting. When the defender is making the recovery run, she's sprinting, but then she rests. So the overall intensity might be 8 out of 10. It should be, actually. Okay? If it's not, change something. If it's too high, you need to maybe rest a bit more, whatever. If it's too low, rest less, make the sprints longer, whatever it is. Is the volume appropriate? And remember, Liz, we talked about 30 seconds minimum, 10 minutes maximum. That game, 2v2 like that, 2 to 3 minutes is good. Okay. And finally, is the rest period appropriate, which brings your work to rest ratio 1-to-1 up to 3-to-1. So that's it. Again, I'll thank everyone for being here and for your participation and lovely discussion. And thank you, Tony, as well, of course. And we'll take questions, and just I'll leave that up there, please, because you all received an email. If anyone's interested in setting up the course, just reply and let us know. Okay, so Tony, you got your hand up, right?
Yeah, I know. Yeah. I wanted to say, Richard.
Yeah.
I would like to think, actually, I know that pretty well we have all done this.
Right.
Without knowing what we were doing.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? We all played small-sided games. We all played full field games. We all played 8v8, 6v6, 1v1, you name it. We all done that without knowing what the heck we were doing. And now we know, right? We know. And so, to continue what you said, then when we plan our sessions, then if we're doing a 4v4 or a 5v5, then we know what we're working on. We know that we're training in addition to our technical skills.
Right.
We're also working on a specific fitness component,
Yeah.
right? So we know that, and if we keep track of all our sessions, at the end of the month, or at the end of the week, we can sum it all up and go, hey, you know what? I've done, so many aerobic sessions, but I haven't done enough anaerobic lactic. I need to change a couple of things. Do you know what I'm saying?
Right.
And so, and you don't need to do that when I say all the time. If you do it for one season, then you can take what you've done in that season, look at it, and then fix it. And then the next season it will be better. And then after that, it becomes routine, right? It becomes, yeah, I know what I'm doing. I'm training my players. I'm training their fitness, soccer fitness. I'm doing it properly, and they can perform better, and they can do all kinds of things a heck of a lot better. So I think we have all done this without knowing, but now we know, and so we can be a little bit more, I guess, proud of what we've done, but recognize that maybe we're doing the right thing. We just didn't know that we were doing it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's true. And a lot of, when I explain these things, and I hope it came across, because I showed four, very
Absolutely.
simple exercises, right? But, that really, as a coach, you don't need to change much to build a bit more fitness and to integrate fitness into your practice. You just need to just pay a bit more attention to these things and, plan it and monitor it. And that's, again, in our course, we talk all about how to monitor. I know we mentioned RPE and heart rate and these different methods, but that's important too, because if you have a great plan and everything seems like it's going to go well, but you don't, maybe some players were not feeling well, didn't work as hard. Some others had a bad day, and they were sick or something, and maybe they worked a lot harder than you thought they did. So monitoring and kind of constantly staying on top of tracking everything that's going on is definitely very important. And Tony, you're right too, that coaches like you can very quickly build a good library of small-sided games and exercises that you can use to train the different energy systems. And believe it or not, with periodization, all you then need to do to try to make a small incremental increase in load is make a little change. Instead of playing for 4 minutes, play for 4.5. Instead of resting for 2 minutes, rest for one, take 30 seconds away. Again, we talk about all this in the course, right? But the little changes you make, then you can build and then add a little bit more load or intensity as you go on.
Yeah. Richard, I just wanted to add one more thing.
Yeah.
I think we also need to be careful about this, that, we don't go crazy over it. What I mean is, if I'm coaching 10-year-olds and 11-year-olds and 12-year-olds, just forget about it. Worry about other things. I think the aerobic, the anaerobic will take care of itself. And you tell me if I'm right or wrong. I think that there are other more important, skills or technique to teach the players. It's only when you get, maybe 15, 16, perhaps 14, I would even venture that, you start getting into it, right?
Okay. So like all of your other questions, it depends. Just a couple of things to keep in mind, because overall, you're not wrong. The first thing to keep in mind, boys don't develop at the same rate as girls.
Yes.
So you don't use the same threshold. Usually girls are about 2 years ahead. And so whatever standard you're going to apply to boys, you want to subtract 2 in terms of age for girls for the most part. Second, I think coaches should probably always be paying attention to the aerobic system. And the reason is, and I'll tell you, because I'm a fitness coach, but I'm also a coach and I was a player and all of that. So I know this, that the problem we have here in Canada is that players are not fit enough, and that's the reason why they get hurt a lot. So why are they not fit enough? Because a lot of the practices are, there's too much talking and too much standing around and not enough movement, broadly speaking. So again, all I showed was, hand passing game, counterattack game, whatever it is, these little games or these exercises. The way to focus more on the aerobic system is simply to have smaller groups and to control the rest so that players get lots of repetitions and they keep moving. And I think that's a concept that needs to be built throughout. Anaerobic, which we'll talk next week, right? Speed, and then the following week, we're going to talk about strength and power. And those qualities, they're tied into peak height velocity. Peak height velocity is the age where you reach your maximal rate of growth. And, by the way, in the course, we teach all about this. We teach you how to measure it and all of that, okay? So basically, boys reach their peak height velocity on average about 13 and a half. They're not really going to get much out of anaerobic training until after that. So let's say age 14 for boys. Now, girls reach their peak height velocity at 11 and a half. So it's probably not a bad idea to start some anaerobic work with girls at around age 12, okay? That's kind of the idea. 12 to 12 and a half for girls, 14 to 14 and a half for boys.
Yeah, and Richard, I think there's also another issue when it comes to keeping, the fitness over the season. The way we are set up, and I'm not criticizing anybody, just the reality. The way we're set up is that if you have 15 players on the team, they go in and out, they play 20 minutes, they're off 10, they're on 5, they're on, and so on.
Yeah.
So that really, all of the work, there is no way of being consistent, with their level of fitness, right? There is no way of, you look at 2 months later, you haven't really made any changes, any improvements, I don't think.
Right.
We
And
also have short seasons.
Yeah.
The League One, for example, okay?
Yeah.
League One women, 3 months it's done.
Yeah. Well, I talked about that before, right? So those players, even the best ones, they're not prepared to play in an international camp after that season.
No, they're not. And so, the reality is what it is.
Yeah.
So to your point, I guess, is that do all your work in practice, right? Do as much as you can in practice. Get them ready.
Yeah.
Get them ready.
Yeah.
And then over time, it will all add up.
Yeah, and I'll finish just by saying too that in the pro game, in the university game, in the higher levels, a lot of times there will be top-up sessions, we like to call them, which is so players that didn't play or they didn't play at all, or they played only 30 minutes, or you can even look at the load, because they might have played 30 minutes but they ran a lot, and you can there's different thresholds, but basically the idea is that the players that played less are going to do some extra physical work either on the day of the game or the next day, or while the others are recovering. And so these are all things that I do, that I've done, that the pros and the higher level groups do. And I think that it's worth at the amateur level, especially again after peak height velocity, in the higher, whether it's whatever OPDL, high performance leagues, the more serious players, the coaches need to do this. Overall, as I said, in Canada, okay, specifically in Ontario, because I work here and I live here, right? Players are not in shape. Like the fitness level, I've done thousands of tests. The overall, the fitness level is not good, and there's no other reason for that other than that they're not training hard enough and they're not training enough. So they need to train more. They need to train harder. They need better planned training, and hopefully, stuff like this will help. So
yeah, I think it will. Yeah, it will for sure.
All right, so I think we're good to go.
Richard, hey, thank you very much. Yeah, I have a headache.
yeah, all right, good. Okay.
But it's a good one. It's a good headache. It's a good headache. I always learn from you every time I talk. Even if I talk about anything else, I always learn from you, and I appreciate it. And I think everybody participating and watching today got something out of this. Of course, there's more coming next week and the week after. And if they want to sign up for your course, I don't think it will be money that will be thrown away. It'll be money well spent and time well spent, learning and helping the players. After all, that's why we do it, right?
For sure. Well, you're welcome, Tony. Thank you as well. It's always a pleasure to speak to you, and I know I'll speak to you soon, even before next week. And thanks everyone again. Great discussion. Please, feel free to reach out. As I said, reply to the email. And if you have any other questions, of course, you can message me that way. And we'll see you next week, where we're going to talk about speed and agility.
Richard,
right.
thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.